For years, the public was told that reconciliation between Prince Harry and the royal family was only one emotional phone call away, one carefully arranged meeting away, one family gathering away from finally healing the wounds that exploded after the release of Spare, the Netflix series, the interviews, and the endless stream of accusations that turned private palace conversations into global entertainment. But this week something extraordinary happened behind the scenes of the British media establishment, because the narrative suddenly cracked open from the inside, and what spilled out was not a story about healing at all, but a brutal portrait of collapsing trust, internal media warfare, and one devastating sentence reportedly coming from palace circles that has now frozen the entire royal conversation in place. No one ever wants to see Meghan again. And the reason this moment matters so much is not simply because of the headline itself, but because of where it appeared, who pushed back against it, and what it reveals about the terrifying reality now facing the Sussex operation on both sides of the Atlantic. Because while King Charles III continues carrying out state duties during the most physically difficult period of his reign, while Prince William quietly expands his institutional authority inside the monarchy, and while the working royals continue projecting stability through public engagements, garden shows, diplomatic meetings, and carefully controlled appearances, the California operation built around Meghan Markle and Harry appears to be entering one of the most dangerous periods it has faced since leaving Britain in 2020. Because suddenly the media machine that once amplified every Sussex narrative with near-total discipline has started splitting publicly against itself. And when that happens in royal reporting, it usually means something much bigger is happening underneath. This entire firestorm began with explosive reporting surrounding a rising palace figure named Theo Rycroft, a diplomatic operator who has rapidly gained influence inside Buckingham Palace after helping manage several high-profile international royal engagements, including sensitive meetings involving Donald Trump and major state-level coordination around the King and William. According to one major report, Rycroft allegedly viewed the royal family feud as ridiculous, and had supposedly made it a personal mission to reunite Harry and William for the sake of the King. Now on the surface, that sounds like the kind of emotional reconciliation story audiences have heard repeatedly over the past several years, but then something unusual happened that completely changed the tone of the story. The headline was quietly edited. A question mark suddenly appeared. And inside British newspaper culture, that tiny punctuation mark can mean everything. Because when editors start adding question marks to explosive royal claims after publication, what they are really signaling internally is uncertainty, hesitation, legal nervousness, or worse, disagreement inside the building itself. And that is exactly what appears to have happened. Within days, completely different reporters connected to the same newspaper ecosystem began openly contradicting each other in public about whether any reconciliation effort actually exists at all. One side pushed the idea that quiet diplomatic efforts were underway to slowly rebuild trust between the Sussexes and the palace. The other side essentially demolished the entire concept. And then came the line that changed the atmosphere completely. American royal commentator Paula Froelich, citing a palace-connected source, reported that while the king may still want contact with his son and grandchildren privately, there was absolutely no appetite whatsoever for Meghan's return into the royal orbit, with the source allegedly stating that nobody ever wants to see her again. Not some people. Not certain aides. Nobody. And once that sentence entered the royal media bloodstream, the conversation instantly stopped being about reconciliation and started becoming about rejection. Total rejection. Institutional rejection. Personal rejection. Emotional exhaustion inside the palace itself. But here's where the story becomes even more explosive because according to multiple commentators, the palace no longer believes private conversations with Harry can remain private at all. That means every possible meeting, every family discussion, every attempted healing conversation now carries the fear that it could later appear inside a memoir, a documentary, an interview, or another public media project. Think about what that means for a monarchy built almost entirely on discretion. Think about what that means for a father already battling cancer. And then ask yourself the question royal commentators are now quietly asking everywhere. If trust inside the royal family has collapsed this completely, then what exactly is the Sussex strategy now supposed to be? Because at the exact same moment these reconciliation stories are falling apart publicly, multiple pillars of Harry's post-royal world appear to be wobbling simultaneously. The Invictus Games operation is reportedly facing financial strain and governance instability ahead of Birmingham 2027. Senior figures connected to the organization have stepped away. Corporate sponsorship questions are growing louder. Harry's charitable image has taken repeated hits after controversies surrounding other affiliated organizations. Meanwhile, Meghan's highly controlled image strategy, including carefully curated Instagram releases and anniversary content, is increasingly being interpreted by critics not as authenticity, but as branding desperation disguised as intimacy. And suddenly the timing of these reconciliation stories starts looking very different. Because what if this is not really about healing at all? What if this is about survival? Because for the first time since the Sussex departure, the press narrative itself no longer appears fully under control. And when royal media loses narrative discipline, history shows us that the next phase is usually far more brutal than anyone expected. What makes this entire situation even more extraordinary is that the battle is no longer happening only between the Sussex household and the palace, because now the war appears to be unfolding inside the media itself, and when major royal reporters begin publicly undermining each other's sourcing in real time, it usually means the institution behind the story has entered a phase of genuine instability. Because for years, audiences could usually separate royal coverage into predictable camps. There were the strongly pro-Sussex commentators, the strongly anti-Sussex commentators, and then a smaller group of establishment royal correspondents who operated somewhere in the middle, carefully balancing palace access with controlled criticism. But this week that balance shattered in spectacular fashion as competing narratives exploded out of the same newspaper ecosystem at the exact same time. On one side were reports suggesting there was still a quiet Project Thaw underway, an alleged effort to slowly repair relations between Prince Harry and the monarchy through discreet diplomacy, carefully managed meetings, and behind-the-scenes conversations involving influential palace aides. The framing was emotional, almost cinematic, presenting the king as a father desperate to reduce the pain of a fractured family while trusted figures inside Buckingham Palace allegedly searched for a path toward reconciliation. But on the other side came a completely different version of events, and this version was cold, clinical, and devastating. Because according to several royal commentators and palace-connected voices, the supposed reconciliation narrative was not being driven by Buckingham Palace at all. It was being driven by Harry's circle. In other words, the palace was not quietly moving toward the Sussexes. The Sussexes were quietly pushing stories suggesting the palace might move toward them. That distinction changes everything. And once audiences began noticing that pattern, suddenly years of carefully timed reconciliation leaks started looking very different. Stories about possible Christmas invitations. Stories about secret meetings. Stories about olive branches. Stories hinting that William and Harry might finally speak again. The public had seen these headlines over and over, yet every major royal event continued ending the exact same way. Distance, silence, separation. No visible thaw. No restored trust. No public closeness. Nothing. And according to some observers, that repetition itself has now become the real story. Because when the same emotional narrative keeps appearing without any visible institutional movement behind it, people eventually stop reading it as news and start reading it as strategy. That is the dangerous territory the Sussex operation now appears to be entering. Especially because the palace itself continues behaving in a way that suggests absolute caution around Harry's presence inside the royal system. Multiple commentators have pointed to growing fears that any private interaction could later become public material, whether through interviews, documentaries, memoirs, or unnamed source briefings. That fear has fundamentally changed the mechanics of communication inside the family. Imagine the level of collapse required for a monarchy built on secrecy and controlled discretion to allegedly feel uncomfortable holding completely private conversations with one of its own senior family members. That is not ordinary family tension. That is institutional rupture. And the deeper this story goes, the more it begins revealing a painful reality at the center of the entire crisis. The royal family may no longer view this as a temporary feud at all. They may view it as permanent. Meanwhile, outside palace walls, the pressure surrounding the Sussex brand continues intensifying from multiple directions at once. The post-royal identity Harry and Meghan attempted to build after leaving Britain was supposed to rest on several pillars simultaneously: media influence, philanthropy, celebrity access, commercial partnerships, and moral authority built around the idea of freedom from royal constraints. But now cracks are appearing across nearly every one of those pillars at the same time. The charitable world that once embraced Harry as a globally respected humanitarian figure has become increasingly complicated. Questions surrounding organizations connected to him have created waves of negative headlines, while governance instability and financial concerns around the Invictus Games Foundation continue generating uncomfortable conversations in both Britain and the United States. And then there is the image problem. Because one of the most damaging shifts happening right now is psychological rather than political. For years, Harry and Meghan successfully positioned themselves as the victims of an outdated royal machine. That framing carried enormous power internationally, especially in America, where celebrity culture often rewards emotional openness and public vulnerability. But over time, critics argue that the balance began shifting because the couple never fully stopped talking about the institution they claimed to have escaped. Every interview reopened old wounds. Every documentary revived old grievances. Every carefully timed media appearance pulled audiences back into the same conflict again. And eventually even sympathetic viewers started asking the question the palace reportedly asked years ago. If privacy was the goal, why does everything keep becoming public content? That contradiction is now following the Sussex brand everywhere. Even Meghan's recent anniversary content, intended to project romance and intimacy, triggered another wave of criticism because commentators immediately contrasted the highly private rules surrounding the original royal wedding with the later release of carefully curated personal images from millions of followers online. The symbolism became impossible to ignore. And this is where the situation becomes truly dangerous for the Sussexes because public perception rarely collapses all at once. Instead, it shifts slowly, then suddenly. A failed headline here. A sponsorship concern there. A backlash cycle somewhere else. A celebrity silence that feels louder than applause. And before anyone notices, the narrative momentum that once protected a public figure begins moving in the opposite direction entirely. Right now, that reversal appears to be accelerating. Which is exactly why the palace suddenly looks calmer than the Sussex media machine for the first time in years. And yet the most revealing part of this entire royal crisis may not be the headlines about reconciliation, or the growing financial pressure surrounding the Sussex operation, or even the devastating palace source quote that has dominated the week, because the Real warning sign is something quieter, colder, and far more dangerous for Meghan Markle and Prince Harry than open criticism ever could be. Silence. Not palace silence. Celebrity silence. Because in the modern media world, especially in Hollywood and elite celebrity culture, silence can function as a form of distancing long before public rejection ever arrives. And that is exactly why Meghan's recent anniversary rollout triggered such intense discussion across royal commentary circles, because what people noticed was not simply the photographs themselves, but who did not react to them. No flood of major celebrity endorsements. No overwhelming wave of A-list support. No coordinated social media celebration from powerful entertainment figures. Just a carefully managed content release landing into a strangely restrained atmosphere. And for observers who study celebrity branding professionally, that matters enormously. Because Meghan and Harry's post-royal survival strategy depended heavily on maintaining two forms of power simultaneously. The first was royal relevance, meaning continued public fascination with their relationship to the monarchy. The second was elite American validation, meaning continued acceptance inside the worlds of Hollywood, streaming, luxury branding, philanthropy, and influence culture. For several years, they managed to hold both together. But now both appear increasingly unstable at the exact same time. The royal connection remains powerful enough to generate headlines, but increasingly those headlines revolve around conflict, exclusion, and distrust rather than influence or institutional relevance. At the same time, the American celebrity ecosystem that once treated the Sussexes as symbols of modern reinvention appears noticeably less enthusiastic than it did immediately after the Oprah interview and Netflix launch period. And this is where the psychology of the current crisis becomes fascinating. Because the Sussex brand was originally constructed around escape. Escape from royal pressure. Escape from media intrusion. Escape from institutional control. But over time, the public began noticing something uncomfortable. Even after leaving the monarchy geographically, emotionally, and financially, the brand itself still depended almost entirely on the monarchy for oxygen. Take away the palace conflict, and suddenly much of the public narrative disappears with it. That dependency is now becoming increasingly obvious to audiences. Even Meghan's lifestyle branding efforts, including carefully curated social media launches and domestic imagery, continue being interpreted through a royal lens rather than as independent celebrity ventures. The public is not watching because of recipes, kitchens, or anniversary photos alone. They are watching because she is connected to the House of Windsor. And the palace understands that better than anyone. which is why the working royals have adopted such a disciplined strategy over the past year. Rather than escalating publicly, they have largely continued doing exactly what monarchies survive by doing best: routine, continuity, symbolism, and patience. While headlines exploded around California, King Charles III continued state responsibilities despite his health struggles. Prince William continued expanding his international profile through diplomatic appearances and future king positioning. Catherine, Princess of Wales, remained emotionally central to the monarchy's public image even during periods of reduced visibility. That contrast matters, because the palace no longer appears interested in winning the public war through emotional responses. Instead, it appears focused on something much more effective: endurance. And endurance is dangerous for media-driven brands that rely on constant momentum. Especially because every new Sussex media cycle now risks reopening the same contradiction that critics increasingly point out. If the couple truly wanted total privacy and separation from royal life, why does every major commercial, emotional, or branding moment continue circling back to the royal connection itself? That contradiction now shadows nearly everything they do. It shadows the interviews. It shadows the documentaries. It shadows the podcast discussions. It even shadows the Instagram strategy. And once a contradiction becomes psychologically embedded in public perception, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Meanwhile, the institutional side of the monarchy appears increasingly united around one central reality: trust, once broken at this level, may never fully return. That does not necessarily mean King Charles III no longer loves his son. In fact, many commentators believe the opposite is true. The tragedy is that personal love and institutional trust are not the same thing inside a monarchy. A father may wish privately for peace. An institution may conclude peace is operationally impossible. And that is the emotional tension now hanging over every reconciliation rumor appearing in the British press. Because beneath all the headlines, leaks, and strategic briefings lies one brutal question that nobody inside the palace can publicly answer. How do you rebuild a relationship when both sides fundamentally believe the other side is using the relationship itself as part of a media strategy? That is not a normal family disagreement anymore. That is a total collapse of shared reality. And the deeper this crisis moves into public view, the more it begins resembling something even more serious than a royal feud. It begins looking like the slow separation of two completely incompatible worlds, both still tied together by titles, history, memory, and public fascination, but emotionally operating as if the bridge between them has already burned down. But if there is one development this week that truly terrified palace watchers, it was not the headlines themselves, not the social media reactions, and not even the growing skepticism surrounding the reconciliation narrative, because the most dangerous signal came from something much deeper: the sudden collapse of narrative control inside the very media system that once helped stabilize the Sussex image during moments of crisis. And when that kind of collapse begins, it usually spreads fast. Because for most of the past 5 years, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle operated with one enormous strategic advantage. Even when British tabloids attacked them relentlessly, they could still rely on a powerful international counterweight, especially inside the United States, where influential media figures, celebrity networks, streaming platforms, and social commentary ecosystems often framed them as modern reformers battling an outdated institution. That international support acted like insulation. Bad British headlines could be neutralized. Royal criticism could be reframed as establishment hostility. Negative press cycles could be offset through carefully managed interviews, documentaries, podcast appearances, and emotional storytelling designed to reinforce the same core narrative again and again. Harry and Meghan were not the problem, the system was. But now something appears to be changing. Because the American media environment no longer feels fully synchronized behind them the way it once did. And when celebrity-backed narratives lose synchronization, the shift can be brutal. Take a closer look at the atmosphere surrounding the recent anniversary content release. Under normal circumstances, a carefully curated rollout featuring unseen royal wedding photographs should have triggered an explosion of celebrity engagement, influencer amplification, and emotional commentary across entertainment media. Instead, what commentators noticed was hesitation, distance, restraint. The reaction felt smaller than expected. And in media psychology, reduced enthusiasm from elite cultural circles often matters more than direct criticism because it signals declining emotional investment from the people who once helped drive the public narrative forward. That is precisely why several royal commentators now believe the Sussex brand may be entering a dangerous transition period from fascination to fatigue. Not hatred, fatigue. And fatigue is much harder to fight. Because outrage still generates attention. Fatigue generates indifference. At the same time, the palace has quietly benefited from a completely different emotional dynamic unfolding in public. Over the past year, audiences have increasingly watched the senior royals navigating serious personal challenges without constantly turning those moments into media campaigns. King Charles III continued working through a cancer battle. Catherine, Princess of Wales, became the center of worldwide concern during her own health struggle. Yet despite enormous global attention, the palace response remained remarkably restrained compared to the constant public communication cycles surrounding California. That contrast has had a profound psychological effect on audiences. Because whether people support the monarchy or not, many viewers instinctively respond to visible endurance, discipline, and restraint during periods of pressure. And suddenly the Sussex communication strategy, once praised as emotionally honest and modern, risks appearing overexposed by comparison. Especially because every new public rollout now carries a second invisible layer underneath it: suspicion about motive. Was the timing strategic? Was the release commercially motivated? Was the emotional framing authentic or carefully engineered? Those questions are becoming increasingly common. And once audiences begin instinctively questioning motive before message, rebuilding trust becomes extraordinarily difficult. Meanwhile, the institutional monarchy appears increasingly confident that time itself is now working in its favor. That may sound strange considering the palace endured years of damaging headlines after Harry and Meghan left Britain, but monarchies do not think in quarterly media cycles. They think in decades. That is one reason the royal family has shown so little visible urgency about reconciliation narratives despite endless speculation from commentators and journalists. From the palace perspective, stability matters more than speed, and institutional memory matters more than emotional public relations. Which brings us back to the single most devastating reality at the center of this entire crisis. The monarchy no longer appears frightened of losing the Sussexes. Years ago, that possibility carried enormous risk. Today, the greater fear inside palace circles may actually be allowing them back into the inner system without restored trust. That is an astonishing reversal. Because once upon a time, the Sussexes represented the monarchy's future modernization strategy. Younger, globally marketable, internationally influential, socially progressive, and capable of connecting with audiences beyond Britain. Now, according to multiple commentators, they are increasingly viewed inside royal circles as a permanent reputational risk. Not because of one interview. Not because of one book. But because of the cumulative effect of years of public conflict layered on top of private distrust. And the deeper this week's reporting cycle progressed, the more another uncomfortable possibility started emerging beneath the surface. What if the palace has already emotionally moved on? Not publicly, not officially, but privately. What if the monarchy no longer sees reconciliation as the central objective at all? Because when you strip away the headlines and emotional speculation, the institution itself keeps behaving as though the future has already been chosen. Prince William continues preparing for kingship. Senior royals continue strengthening the working monarchy around a smaller, tighter structure. Public events continue moving forward without visible Sussex involvement. The machine continues operating. And that may be the most painful part of the entire story for Harry and Meghan. Not open hostility. Not public attacks. But the growing possibility that the royal family has quietly learned how to function without them entirely. And perhaps that is the real reason this latest royal media cycle has felt so different from all the others, because beneath the arguments about reconciliation, beneath the dramatic headlines and palace leaks and emotional speculation, a much larger realization now appears to be settling across both the British and American media worlds at the same time. The Sussex story may be entering the phase where the institution stops reacting emotionally and simply keeps moving forward without them. And historically, that is the phase royal households survive best. Because monarchies are designed for endurance. They are designed to outlast scandals, public anger, political crises, generational conflicts, and even internal family breakdowns. That does not mean the pain disappears inside palace walls, far from it, but it does mean the institution itself is trained to absorb turbulence without visibly changing direction. And that is exactly what appears to be happening now. While the press spent the week consumed by rumors of Project Thaw, by competing Daily Mail narratives, by palace source quotes, and by increasingly brutal commentary surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, the working monarchy continued operating with almost eerie normality. State responsibilities continued. Diplomatic engagements continued. Public appearances continued. The machinery of the crown kept moving exactly the way it always has. And psychologically, that contrast matters more than many people realize. Because every new Sussex media cycle now seems to arrive carrying urgency, emotional pressure, and strategic messaging designed to influence public interpretation of the royal relationship, while the palace response remains almost completely unchanged. Silence, distance, continuity. That imbalance creates a powerful visual impression over time. One side appears to be fighting for narrative momentum. The other side appears to be waiting for the storm to exhaust itself. And increasingly, commentators believe the palace may have concluded that patience itself is now the winning strategy. Especially because the broader public mood surrounding the Sussex brand appears more complicated than at any previous stage since the royal exit in 2020. There was once a period when nearly every new project carried an atmosphere of momentum and reinvention. The Netflix deal symbolized influence. The interviews generated global fascination. The podcasts carried prestige. The California transition felt culturally dominant. But now the atmosphere feels different. Not explosive. Not triumphant. Just uncertain. And uncertainty is dangerous in celebrity branding because once audiences begin sensing instability, every new public appearance starts being interpreted through that lens. A lifestyle launch becomes evidence of commercial pressure. A reconciliation rumor becomes evidence of institutional desperation. An Instagram rollout becomes evidence of attention management rather than celebration. The interpretation itself changes. And once that shift happens at scale, regaining narrative control becomes incredibly difficult. Meanwhile, inside royal circles, the future appears increasingly centered around a smaller, more tightly controlled monarchy built primarily around King Charles III, Prince William, and Catherine, Princess of Wales. Every major public appearance reinforces that direction. Every institutional event quietly strengthens the image of continuity beyond the Sussex era. Even the media focus itself has gradually shifted from, will Harry and Meghan return? To, can the monarchy function successfully without them? And the uncomfortable answer emerging this year appears to be yes. That may ultimately become the hardest reality for the Sussex household to confront. Because for years the underlying assumption behind much of the public conversation was that the monarchy somehow needed reconciliation more than the Sussexes needed relevance. But the deeper this current media cycle goes, the more that assumption appears to be reversing in public perception. The monarchy looks bruised but stable. The Sussex brand increasingly looks famous but fragile. And perhaps that is why the quote dominating this week landed with such force. Not simply because it sounded harsh, but because it sounded final. No one ever wants to see Meghan again. Did not read like temporary frustration. It read like exhaustion. Institutional exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that builds after years of repeated conflict, repeated leaks, repeated public battles, and repeated collapses in trust. Of course, royal history has always taught us to be careful about absolutes. Families fracture and reunite. Public enemies reconcile. Institutions evolve. And privately, there may still be emotional doors left partially open, especially where fathers, sons, and grandchildren are concerned. But publicly, the direction of travel now feels unmistakable. The palace appears increasingly focused on the future. The Sussexes appear increasingly trapped fighting the past. And somewhere in the middle sits a global audience watching two completely different survival strategies unfolding in real time. One built on visibility, the other built on endurance. And right now, endurance appears to be winning. So the question moving forward is no longer whether another Sussex headline will appear, because it absolutely will. Another interview, another leak, another reconciliation rumor, another emotional rollout, another carefully timed public moment is almost certainly coming next. The real question now is whether those moments still possess the power they once did, or whether the audience itself has already started emotionally moving on faster than the headlines can keep up. And that may ultimately become the defining royal story of this entire era. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal power struggle surrounding King Charles III, Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and Prince William, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because the next phase of this royal story is already beginning to unfold. And as always, we will be here to break down every signal, every shift, and every hidden detail the mainstream headlines miss.